Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law in 1965, he described the vote as the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice. And America has, in fact, been changed powerfully for the better as a result of that law. But the right of black people and other minorities to vote is once again under fierce and unconscionable attack. We'll talk about this with my guest, Ari Berman, a political correspondent and investigative reporter for The Nation magazine. He's written an important new book called Us The Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Ari, welcome.
Good to see you, Bob.
You too. Congratulations on
Thank
your book. So we've got a lot to cover and not a lot of time. So I guess voting rights is a really important issue, obviously, but I think it has never gotten the kind of attention that was warranted. What made you want to write this book?
Well, I think many people believe that we've settled this issue, that everyone has voting rights, and what's the big deal? And I really came to this issue after the 2010 election, when so many state legislatures flipped from blue to red, and you started to see a new wave of voting restrictions, things like shutting down voter registration drives and cutting early voting and requiring strict voter ID and purging the voting rolls. This was happening all across the country in crucial swing states like Florida and Ohio and Wisconsin, and in places that weren't just in the South, where we typically associate with voting discrimination. It wasn't just happening in Alabama or Georgia, it was happening in Kansas and Pennsylvania. So this was an alarming trend that wasn't getting a lot of attention in early 2011. So I wrote about it for Rolling Stone first, in a piece called The GOP War on Voting, which was really the first national magazine piece to look at this new wave of voting restrictions. Then I just became really interested in how the issue would impact the 2012 election. There were new restrictions passed, there were many laws challenged in court, there were big mobilization efforts for people to overcome these things. All of that was kind of the backdrop to the 2012 election. Then after the 2012 election, the Supreme Court decided to hear a challenge to the Voting Rights Act. And I became very interested in the history of the Voting Rights Act. And I was wondering why, nearly 50 years later, this landmark piece of civil rights legislation was under attack. And that led me to research the history of the Voting Rights Act. And I realized there really wasn't one, generally speaking, accessible, definitive account of what the Voting Rights Act did. So I thought to myself, well, I've covered voting rights for a little bit. Maybe I should write this book. And that's how I came to write it.
So let's set the context. Go back, this is where you open the book actually, go back to the early 1960s in the years just prior to passage of the Voting Rights Act. For black Americans, especially in the South, who wanted to vote, what was the landscape like?
Well, in many places, they just couldn't vote. You look at Selma, Alabama, for example, the most well-known instance of voting discrimination. Only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote. And that number hardly budged, even after the civil rights movement broke out in the 1950s. Just nobody could get on the voting rolls if they were African American. They faced official barriers, things like literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and property requirements. Then they faced unofficial barriers, things like violence, fraud, social and economic retribution. If you tried to register to vote, your address was put in the paper. Everyone knew where you lived. Things like that that would make you a target. And so it was both a climate of official disenfranchisement, but it was also a climate of fear and violence that kept people from even trying to register in places like Selma for so many years.
So because of the incredible violence that occurred in Selma, which were protests on behalf of securing the vote for African Americans. Because of that incredible violence, Lyndon Johnson was, in fact, able to get the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. I'm thinking about the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education desegregation ruling, which really took forever to have a real impact. What about voting rights? Did that have an immediate impact or
Yes.
not?
It was very different than the Brown decision because the federal government knew they had to move incredibly quickly to enforce this law, or else the states just weren't going to obey it. And so the Voting Rights Act was structured in a very powerful way. It struck down things like literacy tests and poll taxes virtually overnight. It sent federal officials to the South to register voters within days of the act's passage. And having federal officials go to a place like Selma, Alabama, and register black voters, where nobody had been registered for literally decades, was absolutely transformative. And you started to see within days and then weeks the numbers of voters quadrupling, quintupling, just increasing dramatically. And then federal officials stayed in the South to make sure elections weren't stolen. And over a longer period of time, they said to those states with the worst histories of voting discrimination, like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, that they had to approve their voting changes with the federal government to make sure those states didn't discriminate in the future. And that meant that you had to follow the Voting Rights Act if you were one of these southern states. You couldn't just ignore it like you did the Brown decision. You couldn't just thwart it like you did with Reconstruction. That this was going to be something that was not just legislatively powerful, but it was actually going to be enforced and make a real difference in people's day-to-day lives.
Now, one of the things that happened is African Americans began to vote. This is especially, again, in the South.
Yeah.
But it became very difficult because of the way districts were drawn, for example, to elect African American candidates. So under the Voting Rights Act, there was an effort to get blacks actually elected to office. Can you talk about that a little bit?
This was a huge struggle that took decades, and I don't think people realize how long it took for someone like John Lewis, the great civil rights hero, to be elected to Congress. Right. He wasn't elected until 1987, so 22 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Andrew Young and Barbara Jordan were the first black members of Congress elected from the South. They weren't elected until 1972, 7 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. What states like Mississippi did after the Voting Rights Act was initially passed and the constitutionality of it was upheld by the Supreme Court was they started to change their election laws to make it harder for newly registered black voters to actually be able to run for office and elect candidates. So Mississippi would do things like, for example, gerrymander political districts so that African Americans couldn't be elected, or they would switch to countywide or citywide elections. So in places where you had a white majority, that white majority would elect every single candidate. And so you'd have a situation where, in like Jackson, Mississippi, was 60% white and 40% black. But because elections were on a citywide basis, every candidate in every elected officer in Jackson was white. So there was still no diversity even years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so there were lots of lawsuits, lots of political campaigns, lots of fights inside and outside of Congress to actually democratize the country, to make the promise of the Voting Rights Act real. That part of it took a very long time.
So one of the remedies was to redraw district lines, both for local, I guess, and federal elections, to take into account the makeup, the ethnic makeup of the population. So the term racial gerrymandering came into the language. Explain how racial gerrymandering worked, if you use that term, and what the controversy was over that. There was a real fight over that.
So what you see in the late 80s and the early 90s is still a dramatic underrepresentation of African Americans, particularly in the South. When John Lewis is elected to Congress in 1987, there were only 2 other African Americans from the South there, even though they were 25% of the South's population. So one of the remedies, one of the chief remedies that was advocated to boost black representation in the South was to draw what became known as majority-minority districts. So find places where there's a majority of black voters and give them some sort of district so that they'll elect a black candidate, because basically the situation even decades after the Voting Rights Act in the South was that if you had a white majority, they by and large weren't going to vote for a black candidate, that you had to have a black majority to elect a black candidate. That was just a sad fact. And so drawing these districts, these majority-minority districts, became a way to boost black representation. And this really happened after the 1990 redistricting cycle during the first Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration. And what happened is many new districts were drawn that elected African-American members of Congress. And during the 1992 election, for example, you see a huge increase in the number of black members of Congress. What that also did is, as the number of black members of Congress increased, the number of white Republican members increased too. Because what happened is black Democrats were taken out of white Democratic districts. They were put in these new majority-minority districts, and the rest of the districts became more Republican. So representation was boosted for two underrepresented groups.
Right.
Just so happened that they were African Americans and they were also white Republicans.
So you were siphoning, by putting African American voters into essentially black districts, you were siphoning Democratic votes from areas that were, sometimes would go Democratic.
Yeah.
Now, one of the weird things, and you made this clear in your book, is that Republicans, many of whom were hostile to voting rights for blacks, suddenly got the idea, well, you know what, let's draw up these districts so that you can have more African Americans, let's say, in Congress, for example, because it will help us.
Yeah.
But the other side, this also Republicans and conservatives, were saying, well, just as you shouldn't discriminate on the basis of race, or you shouldn't take race into account in order to discriminate, you shouldn't take race into account when you're developing your remedies for discrimination. And that became a big fight. How do you see that issue? Did they have a point, or is that a specious argument?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated issue, the whole drawing of these districts, because it definitely did benefit, to some degree, white Republicans. It wasn't responsible for the South becoming Republican, because the South was voting on presidential levels and senatorial levels for Republican candidates well before the drawing of these districts. But it is true that it helped the Republican Party. It's also true that if you didn't draw these districts, you weren't going to get African Americans elected in large numbers to the Congress.
So you would essentially never have any blacks elected to these
I mean,
offices.
there was such racially polarized voting, particularly in the South, that if whites wouldn't vote for a black candidate, the only thing you could do was draw districts so that blacks would form a majority and they could elect a black candidate. I mean, that was just a sad reality. And so there were really no good options here. Right. Many black Democrats, people like John Lewis, were conflicted about the drawing of these districts, but they saw it as the only way to boost representation.
So let's talk about the backlash. So this law, which is being vigorously enforced, is having an effect. And then there's a backlash. You have a chapter called The Counter-Revolution. How did those who were hostile to voting rights fight back?
Well, there was always an attempt to try to gut the Voting Rights Act. You had Southern conservatives who tried to challenge the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act immediately after its passage. States like South Carolina and Mississippi and Alabama, they were unsuccessful. Then you had Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, where Nixon is pledging to gut the Voting Rights Act to win the votes of Southern conservatives like Strom Thurmond. But the counter-revolution, in my view, and I know this is something that you've also written a lot about, really came of age during the Reagan administration.
Yep.
Because heretofore, the Republican Party had been unsuccessful in trying to gut the Voting Rights Act. And even candidates like Nixon, after trying to gut it, pulled back. But Reagan was someone who opposed the Voting Rights Act, opposed the Civil Rights Act, opposed the Fair Housing Act. You had never had a Republican candidate for president hold such extreme views on civil rights. And if you did, like Barry Goldwater, they got crushed. And so for Reagan to be elected holding these views meant that we were going to see a very different movement on civil rights, particularly within the Republican Party. And under Reagan, you see this counter-revolution emerging, and you see the beginning of a conservative legal movement that's very hostile to voting rights and to civil rights more broadly. So that's where people like John Roberts, now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they come of age politically during the Reagan administration. And one of the ways they come of age politically and intellectually is by opposing the civil rights laws of the 1960s and trying to undermine the effectiveness of things like the Voting Rights Act.
You mentioned John Roberts, the current Chief Justice.
Yeah.
He was a clerk to William Rehnquist, a former Chief Justice. Talk about their relationship a little bit in relation to voting rights.
Well, it was a pivotal relationship. I think many people don't realize how radical Rehnquist was, particularly on civil rights issues.
I agree.
When he was appointed by Nixon in the 1970s, he was known as the Lone Ranger because he was so far out there. He was someone who, for example, believed that Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided. He believed that an all-white Democratic primary in Texas was constitutional. He was someone who had personally administered literacy tests to black and Hispanic voters in Arizona. really, really unconscionable things that he had done and said. And yet he was appointed by Nixon on the Supreme Court, and then he becomes very influential in nurturing the next generation of conservative legal scholars. And so when Roberts goes and clerks for Rehnquist after graduating from Harvard Law School in 1980, Rehnquist's office is basically the Federalist Society before there is a Federalist Society. He's nurturing the next generation of conservatives. And so Roberts takes from Rehnquist this kind of old school states' rights conservatism, which we thought had gone out of fashion after the 1960s. But Rehnquist is trying to resurrect this doctrine of states' rights.
Right.
And Rehnquist really becomes Roberts' entree to the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration basically adopts Rehnquist's views, which were once so extreme that he was known as the Lone Ranger, as the majority opinion within the Department of Justice at the time.
First with Roberts, let's stay with him for a moment. He was always hostile to voting rights, even as a young guy. And it seems to me, from reading your book, even before he was a clerk to Rehnquist. Is that correct?
Well, we don't really know a lot about him when he was at Harvard and Harvard Law. He was very bright. He was very conservative. And a professor of his described him as a conservative looking for a conservative ideology in American history. And I argue that he got that ideology first from Rehnquist, in terms of his belief in states' rights, his belief that the government really shouldn't have an affirmative role to play in ameliorating historic instances of discrimination, and then in Reagan. And during the Reagan years, you start to see, as you mentioned earlier, this broad backlash to civil rights, arguing that things like busing and affirmative action and drawing districts to benefit Black or Hispanic candidates, that all of these things are in of themselves discriminatory. So the effort to root out discrimination becomes something that is now described as discriminatory. And this was known as colorblindness.
Right.
And basically, Roberts becomes a chief proponent of this ideology. And during the Reagan administration, when there was a battle over whether to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act in Congress, Roberts writes memo after memo after memo. He's really the point person on this, arguing that the Voting Rights Act will lead to things like affirmative action in the electoral sphere and quotas in electoral politics. And you can't just argue that he's doing his job, because he's so passionate. He's arguing to the highest levels of the Reagan administration as a young aide that they need to take the most aggressive stance possible against the Voting Rights Act. So it's amazing for someone who was 25, 26, 27 at the time to have such influence. It's amazing to see the hostility of his views, and it's amazing to see how he was rewarded for these views by becoming Chief Justice and then playing such an instrumental role in gutting the Voting Rights Act 30 years later.
So this anti-voting rights campaign became clear, or should have become clear, in the the disputed 2000 presidential election, especially in Florida. So talk a little bit about the ways in which voting is actually being suppressed. I mean, it's myriad ways, but talk about some of the ways. And it started, or at least started to become clear, as I said, in Florida.
Yeah, you wrote a lot about Florida at the time, and it's a huge issue that I think people have never really grappled with, just what happened in Florida. In the run-up to that election in 2000, there was a massive voter purge by the state done by a private entity. And they claimed that tens of thousands of felons were illegally on the voting rolls and needed to be purged. And Florida is one of those states where ex-felons couldn't vote, which dated back, by the way, to the Jim Crow era.
Right.
And so all of these people were purged from the voting rolls because they were supposedly felons. There were two problems with that. One was that the list was very inaccurate. People were labeled as felons even if their last names, their middle names, their sex, their race, all of that stuff didn't match perfect.
Right, so they didn't have to, under the laws or the regulations, they didn't actually have to match.
There only had to be a 70% match. So let's say your name was, let's say your name wasn't Bob Herbert, it was Bob Jimenez or something. Right. I mean, even something like that, it's possible that you could end up on that purge list, or if your name had an E after it or something like that. I mean, you could have ended up on the voting rolls. And the other problem with this list is that it was discriminatory, that African Americans made up 11% of registered voters in Florida, but 44% of those on the purge list. So on election day, when people were wrongly purged from the voting rolls, because they were supposedly felons, even though they weren't, they were disproportionately African-American voters. This made a huge difference because black voters disproportionately voted for Al Gore, 90% for Al Gore in Florida. And so after the election, the NAACP sued Florida. And then they ran the numbers again, and they found that 12,000 people were wrongly purged from the voting rolls. That was 22 times George W. Bush's 537 vote margin of victory. Wow. So I really think this voter purge could have cost Al Gore the election. And it was such a big deal because after that election, Republicans realized that small manipulations in the electoral process, like the voter purge, could make a huge difference in close elections going forward. And so we started to see a lot of new efforts to make it harder to vote after the Florida 2000 election.
So then in 2013, you get what I call the coup de grace. You get the Supreme Court ruling, essentially demolishing the effectiveness of the Voting Rights Act. Explain what that ruling said and what the consequences have been.
Well, one of the most effective, and probably the most effective part of the Voting Rights Act was this requirement that states like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, most of the South and also some other parts of the country, had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. Because this meant the federal government, either the Justice Department or the courts, could stop voting discrimination before it actually occurred, which was a remarkable solution to the problem of voting discrimination. It made the Voting Rights Act so powerful. It meant that states had to comply with it. And what the Roberts Court did is they struck down the formula that determined which of those states had to approve their voting changes. So basically, theoretically, you could still have to approve your voting changes with the federal government. The thing is, under this ruling, there were no states covered. And so practically speaking, places like Texas and Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama and North Carolina, they no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And so what it meant is that those states that had historically discriminated most aggressively and most frequently, they were now freed from powerful federal oversight.
So now what happens if, for example, you find that there is what appears to be a clear-cut case of discrimination, voter suppression, or whatever, you don't have the remedies from the Voting Rights Act under Section 5. What are the remedies now? How do you fight this?
Well, there's another part of the Voting Rights Act that's still in effect, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that applies nationwide. The problem with Section 2 is that you can only challenge things once they're put in place. And so let's say a new voter suppression law is passed in North Carolina, and North Carolina is a good case study because a month after this Supreme Court decision, they passed a law that essentially repealed or curtailed every voting reform in the state. So they cut that. They cut early voting. They eliminated same-day registration. They required strict voter ID. They eliminated pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, which was taught in high school civics class. They eliminated Citizens Awareness Month, which was done to encourage people to register. All of this was put in one bill. Previously, North Carolina would have had to approve that bill with the federal government. They would have never passed. Because we see clearly from the data that African-American voters were more likely to vote early, more likely to use same-day registration, more likely to not have a government-issued ID. But now, after the Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act, this law is in effect. It can only be challenged on a lengthy legal basis after a very long trial that's going to go through a number of different processes. In the meantime, those voters who are facing discrimination, they have the burden of proof of showing that the law is discriminatory. And what we saw in the 2014 election, which was the first election after the Supreme Court ruling, is that the courts refused to block this North Carolina law, and that thousands of people were turned away from the polls as a result. So it's still possible to block some of these most extreme measures. The Texas voter ID law has been blocked, at least temporarily, by the Court of Appeals on the Fifth Circuit. But it's much harder. And voters are being disenfranchised in the meantime. And the very things that the Voting Rights Act was meant to stop are now being allowed to go through.
Well, we've run out of time, much to my chagrin, because I have other questions I'd love to ask. But Give Us the Ballot by Ari Berman is a really important book, and thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks so much, Bob.
Right. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. I was sad to hear recently that Joaquin Andujar had died. He was an uninhibited, even fiery Major League pitcher who played for the St. Louis Cardinals, the Houston Astros, and the Oakland Athletics. Andujar was well known both for his temper and for quotes that sometimes rivaled the wacky witticisms of Yogi Berra. During one of his rare reticent periods, Andujar explained, "That's why I don't talk, because I talk too much." His manager with the Cardinals, Whitey Herzog, told the press, "It was no problem getting along with Joaquin. I didn't talk to him on the days he was mad, and he was mad all year long." Andujar was sensitive to press criticism and suspected, perhaps because he spoke with a Dominican accent, that reporters felt he was stupid. "If I was stupid," he said, "I wouldn't have pitched in the World Series. I'd be playing ball in Mexico or Yugoslavia or on Pluto." The New York Times captured something of Andujar's personality in his obit, writing in the lead paragraph that he had pitched in 2 climactic World Series games for the Cardinals, winning one and being ejected from the other. My favorite Andujar quote is this one: "You can sum up the game of baseball in one word: you never know." That's all for now. See you next time.